Hello mate, and welcome to a new series of Daz Studio tutorials. This is going to be a much more direct tutorial series than previously done. The idea is that I'm going to teach you methods or ways of doing things that are going to benefit you from the word go. So whether you're an absolute beginner or someone who's coming back after a while, hopefully this video series is going to be ideal for you. Now what I found is that when you ask 10 different Daz Studio users where you think you should start learning, you're going to get 10 different answers because different people think in different ways and different people learn the basics in very different ways. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by just looking at the interface here, and what you can see is that the interface is set up into these tabs. Now these tabs, you can undock them and redock them in different areas of the screen as much as you want to, so you can configure your UI how you see fit. Now what I've got is, as you can see, like the main tool settings and things like that in a separate window, and in order to achieve that, what you have to do is, I'll just bring this back over here for a sec, in this little burger menu here, if you select that, what you can see is make pane dockable or make pane undockable. This is going to change dependent, and in order to get this second window that I've got here, I had to make the pane undockable, which just then means that you get two windows, and it means that I can't accidentally dock any of these tabs in any of the other areas. So it means that I can keep these separate without accidentally shoving them somewhere else. Now right now, if you're a brand new user to Daz, the chances are that's gonna seem fairly irrelevant. You're not really gonna necessarily have context with which to see how useful that is, but trust me, the further you get down the line, the more useful that's going to appear, because we've all done it where we've been tweaking our UI, moving things around the screen, or even introducing a new window, which we do here. If we go window and then we can see panes, brackets, tabs, all of the potential windows that you're going to need for your rendering are all contained within this. And if you accidentally bring one onto the screen, or if you intentionally bring one onto the screen, so let's just bring in the posing one. Now what you can see is that that's already docked, but if you was to bring in one that hadn't previously been docked, you're going to end up with something that's going to look more like this. And then if you start dragging this around the screen, there's a possibility that you're accidentally going to dock it in one of these, and it's just going to cause you no end of trouble. It's just frustrating and irritating. As you can see now, that's now stuck over there. So yeah, you basically have to dock it somewhere else in order for that to be the case. So we'll just get rid of that, and then we can drag that off there, and then we can close it like so. Get rid of that, don't need it. Cool. So when we set up our user interface, what we want to do is do that, make it so that it's useful to us, and then under help, I believe it's under help, when we come into no, it's actually under window and then workspace, you can actually save your layout by pressing F4, and then you can choose what you're going to call your layout. So I don't know, let's just call this one layout, for example, and then you can just hit accept, and it's saved it. It can be accessed via Windows Workspace, select layout, and then you can choose that. If you ever accidentally stuff up your UI, you can revert back to the one that you have saved. So I strongly recommend you doing that. Okay, that's enough talking about that stuff. All of these buttons and things are going to start making sense once you start using them. I can go through them all and explain them all to you, but realistically, I'm pretty sure that as a new user of Daz, you don't want to sit there and listen to someone talk about what each individual button does. You'd rather just figure it out as we go along. So that's what we're going to do. Now, a scene consists of several things. It consists of the subject, i.e. the thing that you're rendering, consists of lights, which is vitally important. If there's no lights, there's no render, and then a camera. So let's first of all start with creating a subject. So in this case, we're just going to create a cube. I'm going to click on this icon up here that looks like three shapes squished together, and then you'll get this create new primitive window. This new dialog will appear, and you can choose which one of these shapes you want to create. You have a limited option of 6 primitives, and then you can decide where you want it to be, whether you want Y positive, etc. But for now, just focus on these options. We want our cube to be 1 meter, and we want it to be 1 division. We don't need any subdivisions right now because we don't need that geometry for any reason. It's just adding vertices for the sake of adding vertices. Vertices is the plural of vertex, vertex is a point in 3D space that consists of an X, Y, and Z direction. Gonna hit that there. So there we can see our cube, and if I were to go into using this cricket ball looking icon here next to this tab here, click on that, and then you can see we've got various different options. I'm going to go to wire texture shaded, and if you'll notice very subtly the outlines of the faces appeared. What we have here is a cube which consists of six quads that share vertexes or vertices. One vertex here, as you can see, is the focal point of these three edges, and which are also comprised of these three faces, i.e. we only have 8 corners, 8 vertices create 6 faces, which creates one cube. If we were using something along the lines of like a Minecraft style map, then this vertex here would actually be shared by the adjacent cubes as well. So you'd have one there, one to the side, one to the back, and then one in the gap, and then one above the one in the gap. So this vertex would suddenly become integral to 8 different cubes, not just the one that it's attached to. So you don't need to baffle your mind with that right now, but suffice to say that vertices are obviously very important because they are what allow us to draw edges and faces on our screen. You'll notice that I'm clicking on this widget in the corner, and as you can see it's rotating around a point in space, but it's not at the center of this cube. It's actually rotating around a default position that Daz Studio defines as being the center of the universe. If we want to focus on the cube, I'm going to select the cube in the Scene Browser tab here, and I'm actually going to select this icon here, which is going to be, basically this is the frame up button. So now I am rotating around the center or the base of that object. So I can rotate all around it, and just by clicking and dragging the mouse I can rotate, and if I roll the mouse wheel in or out I can zoom in or out. What I can also do, because I've got the W, A, S and D or keyboard navigation button selected, if I press W, S, A and D, you can see that I'm actually strafing around my scene, and you can use that in combination with a widget to navigate the scene quite quickly. What this button next to it does is allows me to actually click in the scene and rotate my camera around its center axis rather than the axis of the object. So those are the two ways of navigating around the scene. Unfortunately, you can kind of do first person view mode if you have this selected. Click in the scene and you can strafe and move forwards and backwards and move your camera around. It's a little bit clunky and it becomes a lot harder to do once you have more things in the scene. I'm also using Q and E to go up and down. So fairly standard ASWD controls. If I get completely lost, like if I end up wandering off all the way over here and I think, oh crap, where's my center of my universe? I can hit this button here and it resets me back to the default position. Failing that, I can select my object and just frame up on that again. And then as you can see, no matter how much I zoom in or out, that remains the focal point of the camera. And there we go, reset that there. Okay, so we've got our cube on the screen, and we're not going to mess around with any of the geometry right now. Suffice to say that you can select, with the geometry editor tool, you can select the different faces, vertices or lines or edges. But for now, we're dealing with really basic stuff. So we've got our cube in our scene, we're going to reset our camera. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use our cricket ball icon again, and I'm going to change to NVIDIA iRay. And what you can see is now we can see our cube as it would appear in our render. Just going to frame up on that a little bit more, make more sense to look at it this way. Now, currently we have no lights in our scene, but what Daz Studio is doing is it's using our default image-based lighting, an HDRI, which is creating a 360-degree light profile. If you go into your render settings and you click on environment, you can see the environment map that's being used is this kind of weird mountainy looking thing here. And that's the default HDRI. You can change that for an image. You can find them on HDRI Heaven and places like that. That will allow you to change the light profile of the overall. Failing that, if you don't want to use one of those at all, although I highly recommend that you do because they're much more efficient than using scene lighting, but you want to turn it off. You can see where it says environment mode, currently says dome and scene. Switch that to scene only. And then what you can see is now there is absolutely no light in our scene. We can see the outline of our cube because we have it selected, but if I were to deselect it, it's completely invisible. So what we need to do now is create lights. Generally speaking, I would advise you to avoid creating new assets in your scene while you're in NVIDIA iRay mode, because it takes a while for it to process what's happening. So you're not going to see the effects of it straight away. So now we need to create a light in our scene. What I'm going to start off with is a spotlight because they're fairly basic. Create a spotlight by clicking on the spotlight icon in the top bar, and then this dialog is going to appear. And we're just going to go with the default settings. Leave it spotlight, spotlight, and apply default settings. Hit accept. And now as you can see, a spotlight has appeared at the center of the scene, pointed straight forwards. I'm not particularly happy with that positioning, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my perspective view here, and I'm going to go to spotlight. I am now using the spotlight as if it were a camera, and I can control it as if it were so. So I'm going to actually back away from our object. And what you can see here is I can use my ASWD key, strafe around the scene, and then point it at the subject like so. Then when I come back to perspective view, you can see the light that we're casting on our object. Now, this is useful in some ways. If you want to turn off being able to preview where the spotlight is in the scene, you can simply switch them off by pressing Ctrl L, and then we go back to our default texture shaded lighting. The light is still there, it's still going to work when we render, but it just means that we don't see how that light's going to fall until we actually do it. Now, if we were to go back to our default view, in fact, let's go back to the cube and frame up on that, and then switch back to NVIDIA iRay mode, you can see that light's a bit dim, and I can alter its properties using the parameters tab here and the spotlight selected in our scene. I'm happy with its transforms, its X, Y, and Z positions, but I want to change the light properties. I can actually turn its illumination off completely. I can adjust the color of the light, so I could make it, let's say, a nice peach color. That's going to throw a little bit of color into our scene. We can turn on and off photometric mode, the spread angle, the beam exponents. These are all settings that I would encourage you to experiment with yourself. The one that I'm primarily interested in is the Lumens flux, how bright the light is. So I'm going to add a 0 to that. You can see 10 times brighter. Now it starts to look a little bit better. I could probably get away with maybe adding another 0 in there. That's quite bright. Let's go for maybe halfway. Let's just remove that and make this 50,000. There we go. I think we're at the point where that light is as bright as it's going to be before this starts to over illuminate or blow out. Blowing out is a photography term which means that we lose all detail in an area to white light. Basically, it becomes completely white in the screen and doesn't contain any light. If you're a stranger to photographic principles, I would strongly recommend reading up on them because they do apply when rendering. That means the exposure triangle, your composition rules, all of those sorts of things, very important. We'll talk about them throughout this video series, but for now, just worry about if you're pointing a light at something that isn't white and it becomes completely white, then there's too much light on it and you want as much detail in your image as possible. So now we've adjusted our light. What I want is to make this light source a bit softer. As a spotlight, they tend to create a lot of specular highlights, which you don't necessarily want, particularly not on characters, faces. You want them to look as natural as possible. Even under bright sunlight, you're going to get less of it than you do in Daz Studio. Now, to illustrate my point, we're going to talk about hard and soft light very quickly. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but I'm going to back my spotlight away from our object a little bit. And then I'm going to come back to my perspective view. I'm going to now adjust the brightness of this light. I'm actually going to see what adding a 0 does. That's too much. So let's bring this down from 50 to 30,000. There we go. Back to the point of pretty much good lighting. And I'm actually going to add a second cube into my scene. I'm going to make this 0.5 meters across. Did I make that 5 meters across? Is that what I just did? Let's delete that. Yeah, I did. Let's create another one. Yep. We want this to be 0.5 meters across. Now, I can't currently see it because it's inside this cube. So what I'm going to do I'm going to go to my Move Widget tool, make sure I've got the second cube selected, and then I'm going to drag it. You can use one axis or you can use two. I'm going to use them one at a time. Make sure I've got that one in the right place and drag this across there like that. Now then, what you can see here is because we're using a spotlight, we have an incredibly hard shadow, which in this instance isn't a big problem, but if you're dealing with characters, you want the shadows to be nice and soft. You don't want hard light or hard shadows on people's faces and their dimensions because it just looks wrong. The eye just isn't going to believe it. You're not going to be able to convince the user that it's real. So what we need to do is soften this light source up. Now we can use ghost lights, which is something that we're going to talk about in another video. But for now, what we can do is we can change the diameter of our light source and we can make it bigger. Let's go with 200. And then we need to change our light geometry from point to sphere. And then as you can see now, we've got our spotlight is a bigger light source. It's more spherical. And that's given us a much softer shadow, and we can adjust the diameter of our sphere. We can make it even bigger. Let's go with 20,000. Now the light itself has rapidly dropped off because the light, the output of 30,000 lumens is now spread over a much wider surface. So we actually have to increase that. I would be so bold as to add a couple of zeros to that, and even that's had a really insignificant effect. And also because our light geometry is now massive, what you'll find is that our object itself is now contained within it. So I may have actually overstated the importance of changing that. So let's just take the zeros back off of that, come to our spotlight, and now we're going to have to back away because we've now got a 20-meter radius around which this light source is massive, in other words. So now we have to add some numbers to our lumens, and you have to play with these and get them bang on. It's going to take too much faffery for me to spot this. So let's just drop that back down. Let's bring our diameter back down. That's 20,000. That's 200 meters. So let's try dropping that back down. There you go. So now it's 20 meters. That's a 20-meter wide light source, which is freaking massive. So we're going to have to tweak our light source a little bit. This is fine. It's an okay way of doing this, but as I said, I wouldn't recommend using this overly, but it illustrates the point that we've got nice soft shadows now. So I can come back in a little bit closer. We are a 20 meter high light source. As you can see, it doesn't take long for these guys to get embedded in there. I would never actually use a 2 meter high light source is fine. And as you can see now, we can get in much closer. There we go. Nice and bright, nice and soft shadow anyway. So there you go. We've created a light source. We've now used that to illuminate our scene. We've got rid of our HDRI for the time being. What I want to do now is, using the perspective view is fine, but it has no controls for me to play around with to adjust how the camera looks at the scene. So I can't mimic a real world camera lens. So what I want to do is create a camera. So I'm going to actually create a new camera by clicking on this button in the top left hand corner here, apply default settings, and hit accept. And now you can see a whole bunch of other white lines have appeared on the screen. If we actually rotate our camera and go back into texture shaded mode, what you can see is that the camera is there, and what the rectangle in front of it is showing us is what the frame is going to cover. So currently our two shapes are going to be contained within our frame. If I jump to our camera using this view mode here, I can jump into the camera, and as you can see, it's going to show what the camera is actually seeing. With our camera selected in the scene tab, there's a camera property in the parameters, and now you can see I can adjust things. I can do stuff. And I can actually adjust quite a lot of things. I can actually copy the number of blades and the thickness of the lens and all sorts of things that are going to help us mimic real world lenses. So if you're a photographer and you want to mimic one of your prime lenses, Daz Studio does an okay job of simulating those things. It's never going to be perfect, but it's okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rotate my camera around to this angle, and then I'm going to back away loads. I'm backing away quite a bit, and then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to adjust the focal length. So I'm going to zoom in as if I were using a long lens camera. So it's 947mm. We probably don't want it to be that. Let's go back to maybe 900. If you want to input the number directly, just click on the number, type in 900, hit enter, and then there you go. Now if we go into NVIDIA iRay mode, you can see as if we're a real camera. Now what you'll notice is there is a reflection on this cube. We're going to talk about the surfaces tab and how you adjust the surfaces properties and another video. But what this one actually shows you is that there is actually a glossy property on this cube which is reflecting ever so slightly. So how do I do depth of field? I'm going to click on depth of field, and as you can see currently it's not actually terrible. It's not actually terrible. It's actually quite close to being where I want it to be. But what I want to do is come back to texture shaded mode, jump out of my camera view, and then what I can see here, this little space in between these two rectangles there is actually showing me where my focal distance is, and I can move it forwards and backwards so I can focus on the front edge of my cube there. And if I change the f-stop of the lens, that actually increases or decreases the focal range, the focal width. The amount of basically anything between these two spaces is going to be completely in focus, and then the further away from these two, the space here is, the more out of focus it's going to be. So we'll start off by having a nice wide f-stop, 139. I don't know if there are many lenses that have that, but we'll go back into our camera and we'll go into cricket ball icon, NVIDIA iRay mode, and we can see both of our objects are pretty well in focus. Now let's jump down to f22, which is the default, and as you can see this front corner of the cube is now still in focus, but this cube is now out of focus, as is the back of this cube. So we can use depth of field to our advantage to make certain parts of the object the focal point, but we have to remember not to go too mad with our depth of field, otherwise things are going to start looking weird, which anyone who's ever used an f1.2 lens will be able to tell you is quite frustrating. So there we go, we've got a light, we've got a subject, and we've got a camera. Those are the really basic parts of using Daz Studio. We're going to go into more depth in the next one. We'll talk about more specific functions. Hope you found that useful though, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, alright? Bye bye.